Spain's broad and vaguely worded law is resulting in the silencing of free speech and the crushing of artistic expression. Sending rappers to jail for song lyrics and outlawing political satire demonstrates how narrow the boundaries of acceptable online speech have become in Spain.
In Spain, joking about terrorism can land you in prison. Just ask some of the country's musicians, artists and journalists who have been sentenced under Article 578. The legislation bans the public glorification of terrorism. In the past 6 years, the number of convictions under the law have almost doubled. Amnesty International is now calling for it to be repealed, saying it's vague and is increasingly being used to dismantle freedom of speech. Well, to discuss this, we're joined now from London by Eda Seyhan. She's the author of Amnesty International's report on Spain's anti-terror law, Tweet If You Dare. And in Barcelona, in support of the legislation, is lawyer Carlos Rivadulla. Carlos, let me begin with you. Is this really necessary? Puppeteers and musicians and artists and so forth getting banged up for tweets?
Well, there's been definitely a huge controversy, but I don't think there is any risk for freedom of expression or speech in Spain. Despite some cases, there is not at risk. Freedom of speech is not in danger in Spain. That's the main first statement, I should say.
Okay, but you're saying there are some cases, but then you're saying there's no risk. The two don't seem to match. You're a lawyer. You can understand why I see a discrepancy there.
No, what I mean is that freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it's basically unlimited. And there are thousands of alternative expressions. It is true that some courts have sentenced some specific expressions to be either denigratory or, because they glorify terrorism, to be, punished in a way. But I don't think freedom of speech is really at risk, despite some controversies. Yes, I admit that.
Okay, Eda, freedom of speech is not at risk in Spain, according to Carlos. You're from Amnesty. Tell me why you disagree.
Well, I think the figures really speak for themselves. So the law in question, Article 578, which prohibits glorifying terrorism or humiliating the victims of terrorism, one person was convicted under this law in 2011. By 2017, the number had risen to 31. In the last 2 years, we've seen about 70 people convicted for this law. In a number of those cases, we see very severe restrictions on the right to freedom of expression. So you mentioned in your introduction someone being in prison for tweeting a joke. Indeed, in one of the cases, a young woman by the name of Cassandra Vera was sentenced to a suspended sentence of 1 year for a joke she tweeted about a ETA victim and former Prime Minister, Luis Carrero Blanco. This is just one example of many of the restrictions on freedom of expression that this law entails.
Carlos, if there's no problem, why are opposition parties, Carlos, tabling legislation to try and fix this or amend 578, if there's no problem?
Well, of course, there's some controversies because, again, first of all, what we've seen since 2011, since the terrorist group ETA ceased fire, because before, when they were active, it was too sensitive to actually glorify them or to make jokes about it, etc., etc. It is true that when the terrorist group stopped acting, many people feel more comfortable expressing their opinions. And again, Cassandra, as she mentioned, Cassandra was absolved. She's not serving any time. And actually, there's no one in Spain serving time because of a tweet. It is a more profound and a deeper expression. For instance, let me give you an example. Do you think it's okay for some rap singer to say, "I wish somebody killed you"? Is this the typical speech should be protected? Is this positive for society and for plurality and for expression of ideas?
So let's ask Eda,
to allow people saying...
Eda, hate speech, right? So what Carlos is essentially saying that some of this that you're defending, or some of the people who you are defending as being victims of this, are actually promulgating hate speech, and that's why they're in trouble.
Well, there's a very specific definition of hate speech under international law, and Carlos is correct that states are entitled to prohibit hate speech. But the cases we looked at, the cases including that of Cassandra's, these do not constitute hate speech. These are not statements made that incite national, religious or racial hatred. Let's think about what Cassandra actually said. She tweeted a meme about a ETA victim and former Prime Minister who was killed 44 years ago. Now, although she was acquitted, Carlos is correct in saying that, the devastating and disproportionate impact of the prosecution remains on her life. She lost a scholarship. She lost a year of university. She suffered a huge amount of transphobic abuse on Twitter because of her conviction. Many people in Spain are having these devastating and disproportionate restrictions on their right to freedom of expression. And the impact of these is considerable, even in those cases where people don't actually enter prison.
Right. So, Carlos, what you're saying is essentially there are some red lines here. You must understand the sensitivities. Now, we all know the devastation that the civil war with ETA caused in the Basque region and beyond, right? But again, who gets to decide? If the law is extremely vague, who gets to decide what is offensive and what is not? Is it just a case-by-case basis based on the judge?
Always, at the end of the day, in a rule of law system, always the judges have the last word. It is true that societies change, and the concept of right and wrong, whether it's ethical or moral, it changes as well. Also, what happened, actually, as she mentioned, Cassandra was acquitted. Another thing is the consequences of being in court and being prosecuted. Actually, she's got right to damages, nevertheless. But the thing is, again, it's been too much noise because of the terrorist group. It wasn't a civil war, it was a terrorist group. Because of the terrorist group cease of military or weapon actions, that many people feel now they can glorify them or say something that, again, it is very denigratory for the relatives. Imagine some rap singer saying, "I'm so happy your husband was killed." I mean, do you think this is freedom of speech? Do you think,
you put that out again.
So
but you did say earlier that freedom of expression is absolute in Spain. Now you're saying there are some limitations.
It's very in danger.
Okay, Eda Seyhan and Carlos Rivadulla, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.